any change is beginning to take place. I mean, right now there isn't, but it can in the near future or in the future. I'm going to focus first on North Korea's responsibilities at the United Nations, because that is the one forum. They're a member state of the UN, and that is the one multilateral forum at which North Korea's human rights record is actually discussed, and where resolutions are adopted. So the first question is, will North Korea establish a dialogue with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights? Since 2003, the UN's chief human rights advocate has tried to establish a dialogue with North Korea. UN bodies have called on the High Commissioner to establish technical cooperation programs with North Korea. What does that mean? That would mean rule of law programs. It would mean setting up a national human rights commission in the country. It would mean incorporating human rights standards into laws and policies in North Korea. But there have been no results on this score, and that's what the High Commissioner has reported to UN bodies. But the Secretary General in 2010 sent an envoy to North Korea to discuss a number of issues, and that envoy urged North Korea to please establish technical cooperation with the United Nations. So North Korea's new leaders have to decide whether or not they're going to collaborate with the UN, whether there's any benefit in it for them to do so. And if they collaborate, are they going to ask for certain conditions? And that's a subject in itself. But the question is, what steps will they take? Second, will they invite the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in North Korea to visit? Since 2004, there's been a rapporteur. And Greg mentioned this is Marzuki Darusman, who was a former Attorney General of Indonesia. And he is now the rapporteur. He would like to visit North Korea. But he has not received an invitation to do so. Were North Korea to invite him to visit, it would signal a readiness to open up the country to human rights scrutiny. Will we see that? Third, will North Korea agree to implement the recommendations made at the UN's Universal Periodic Review? Greg mentioned this UPR, as it's called. The UN's main human rights body, the Human Rights Council, reviews the human rights records of all UN member states every 4 years. North Korea's review was 2009-2010. Other governments made 167 recommendations to North Korea. North Korea rejected 50 out of hand, but it separated out 117 recommendations, and it said it would examine them. These 117, and looking at them, they include setting up a National Human Rights Commission in North Korea. They include accepting international labor standards for workers, joining the International Labor Organization, allowing technical assistance programs with the High Commissioner, as I mentioned before, allowing access to the International Committee of the Red Cross to detention centers. They didn't reject that one out of hand. But in the end, they did not identify one recommendation that they said they would implement. They've been widely criticized at the UN for this. A resolution of the General Assembly, more than 120 states, criticized their failure to select those recommendations to implement and are pushing them to do so. That's what the resolution says. So again, North Korea's leaders have to decide whether or not they're going to collaborate with the UN and identify any recommendations to implement. So again, it's another issue that comes up that has to be decided in Pyongyang. Fourth, will North Korea provide information to UN bodies about individual cases of prisoners and persons it abducted, foreigners it abducted? You recall that in 2002, with regard to abductions, the North Korean Kim Jong-Il apologized to the Japanese Prime Minister and admitted that North Korea had abducted Japanese. And then they allowed 5, they returned 5 after 20 years. But there are more there. And as Greg has pointed out, there are also South Koreans, quite a number, dating back to the Korean War. There are Europeans, there are Middle Easterners, there are Asians. And so there is a question about whether or not North Korea is going to provide information to the UN about those abducted and also about prisoners. These are individual cases. There are UN bodies on arbitrary detention, on torture, executions, on disappearances, and they asked North Korea about specific cases, and North Korea to date has not provided adequate information on these cases. North Korea has reported to the UN that it's changed some of its laws, and that it's shortened pretrial detention, and that it's restricted nighttime interrogation. It's unclear whether they actually do this, but there was an effort to make their laws more amenable to international standards. But it hasn't cooperated with the UN in looking into individual prisoner cases. Will they in future? If they do in future, it will acknowledge that they're holding political prisoners, which they don't acknowledge, and that they're ready to improve conditions of these prisoners. Will North Korea fifth amnesty political prisoners and make available information about those released? Now, January 29th, there was an amnesty. It was the first one, I think, in 4 years in North Korea. But no one knows whether there were political prisoners released in that amnesty. There's an unconfirmed report that some women border crossers who had crossed into China, that some of them were released, but as I say, it wasn't confirmed, and there are no public lists. If there were lists, it would be a sign of lifting secrecy around those incarcerated for political reasons. The next amnesty is due April 15th, on the occasion of Kim Il-sung's centenary. Greg mentioned the case of Oh Kil-nam. It's important that there's finally an individual case because for very long, for decades, North Korea's prisoners have been nameless and faceless. So here's a real case. It was a South Korean economist. He was lured to the north. He went with his wife and his 2 daughters. And it was a big mistake that he made, but he did it for many reasons. But he went to the north and then he couldn't come out. But then the North Koreans wanted him to go back to Germany, where he had been, and to lure other South Koreans to the north. And he didn't want to do that. So his family decided he should go, because if he refused, he probably would have been put in jail. So he went back to Europe, but he got political asylum. But his wife and 2 daughters were put in a penal labor camp. So he has to live with that every day. It's really the most powerful story. But there's a campaign about this family. Will the North Koreans feel the need to release them from prison? The case also represents a practice of the North Koreans, which is collective punishment, or guilt by association.